Okay, so the table saw is one of the most powerful and versatile tools in the shop. It can do so many different things, but it can also be one of the more intimidating tools for first timers who are woodworking for the first time. So hopefully we can demystify the table saw a little bit and show you safe operation of the machine. So the table saw primarily excels at doing two things. One of them is ripping. A rip cut is a cut that goes along the grain. And the second thing that this table saw can do is cross cutting, which is going across the grain. Depending on the type of cut you're making, we're going to set the machine up in a completely different way. So it's important to understand both operations and why we set up the machine in different ways to achieve those two different cuts. So the first thing that you'll see when you walk up to the machine is that there's this blade guard. This just is a plastic guard that comes down over the blade to keep your hands out of the way. When we're making adjustments, it's nice to be able to flip that up out of the way. This red piece here is called the throat plate, and it covers this area around the blade. So if I remove that, you'll see that the table saw has a 10-inch saw blade that rotates on an arbor, which is connected to the motor of the machine. The saw blade always spins towards you as the operator, and it's got several sharp teeth. This machine is a special type of table saw called a saw stop. What a saw stop does is it can sense the electrical current in your body or in certain kinds of metal. And if you were to touch that blade while it's running, the machine has a highly loaded spring that would release and drop the blade down into the table base within fractions of seconds. So you would not have any catastrophic injury, maybe a small cut. I like to think of the saw stop as an insurance policy. It should not replace good judgment and proper technique when using the saw. Touching the blade is also not the only thing that can go wrong when you're using a table saw. The saw stop only solves for one of those problems. The other major problem that we think about when using a table saw is kickback. And kickback is what happens when a piece of wood gets caught between the blade and something solid like a fence, and it gets kicked back or shot back towards the operator. So when we're using the table saw, we want to do whatever we can to avoid kickback from happening, and also positioning ourselves in such a way that if kickback were to happen, the consequences wouldn't be catastrophic. So we want to make sure that we're always standing to the side of the blade such that if kickback were to happen, that piece of wood would slide past us rather than into us. You want to make sure that there's nothing behind you or people working that might be in the way. And generally, you want to make sure that you're using the correct blade and the correct setup for your operation to avoid kickback from happening in the first place. This table saw usually has what's called a combination saw blade on it. A combination saw blade can do both rips and crosscuts with pretty good results. But there may be cases when you want to change the blade to get better results for either a rip or a crosscut. So I'm going to walk you through how to change the blade. If you look down under the side of the table saw, you'll see two wrenches. These two wrenches are used for changing the blade. So once we've removed that throat plate, you'll see that there are two nuts, one on either side of that blade. We're going to use one of those wrenches in the open position on the left side, and the other one in the closed position on the right side. And we're going to pull those wrenches in opposite directions. So to loosen it, you're going to pull towards you with the right and away from you with the left. To loosen the nut, then by hand, just loosening that nut that's holding the blade onto the arbor. You want to be very careful not to drop that nut down into the table saw mechanism, because if you do, you're going digging. There is also a large flat washer that we're going to slide off. And then we're going to carefully slide the blade off of that shaft. We want to make sure that we're not banging the blade against any metal parts. You'll see that it's got many little carbide teeth. Those teeth are very brittle, and if they were to bang against something metal, they could break or chip. So when we're handling this blade, we want to be very gentle and not be setting it down on anything metal. You can set it down on a scrap of wood or on one of the wooden workbenches. So you can see I have 3 different blades set up here. The first is a crosscut blade. This is a rip blade, and this is the combination saw blade that we just removed. So depending on the type of cut, different tooth pattern on the blade will give different results. So you'll notice that the crosscut blade has many, many teeth. This one has 80 teeth, whereas the rip blade has only 30 teeth. So the number of teeth on the blade is one determining factor. The second factor are these little valleys between each teeth. These are called the gullet. So on a crosscut blade, those gullets are quite small. On a rip blade, they're really large. The third difference, major difference between a rip blade and a crosscut blade is the shape of those teeth. So if you look on the end of a crosscut blade, you'll notice that each tooth has a little angle in it. So this one's pointing up to the left, this one's pointing to the right, this one's pointing to the left, this one's pointing to the right. That's called an ATB, or alternating top bevel. What this does is that the pointy part of that tooth slices the wood fibers on either side of that crosscut to give a really clean, sharp edge. On a rip blade, you'll see that the teeth are flat on top. You don't have that alternating top bevel. This one has a flat top, and then this one also has a flat top, but with the corners knocked off. Sometimes you'll see the corners knocked off, and sometimes you'll just see flat teeth like this. The reason that these teeth are flat is that they kind of act more like a big shovel, in that they're plowing through the grain that is running parallel to the cut. And those gullets are used to sort of collect and clear the long, stringy wood fibers that are being removed as you're doing a rip cut. The reason why you wouldn't do a rip cut on using a crosscut blade, for example, is that those small gullets wouldn't have enough space for those stringy fibers to clear away, and it can bog down the machine, causing burning or even kickback. So for most types of cut, you'll be fine to use the combination blade, but if you're trying to get really precise results, you may want to switch to another one. So I'll put the combination blade back in. But it's a good idea every time you come up to the machine, check what blade is in there and see what kind of operation you're about to do and make sure that it's appropriate to what you're doing. So to put it back in, I'm just going to do everything in reverse. Gently put that blade back in, making sure that the teeth are pointing towards me, not away from me. We don't want that blade running backwards. Then I'm going to take the big washer, flat side towards the blade, sliding it on, and then finally that nut. Then we're going to do the same thing in reverse with the 2 wrenches. So this time pulling towards me with the left and away from me with the right. We just want to give it a little squeeze. There's no need to over tighten with the table saw because it tightens itself as it's spinning. Once you're done with the wrenches, put them back on the hook where they belong. You'll also see inside this table saw mechanism that there is something called a splitter, which is a piece of metal that sticks up behind the blade, which basically just keeps, when you're doing a rip cut, it keeps that wood in line with the blade and keeps the back edge from drifting into the blade, which could cause a kickback. So a splitter, it's also called a riving knife, is a safety mechanism, and it's a good idea to leave it in place whenever possible. There are certain situations in which you might need to remove it. For example, if you're using the crosscut sled, or if you're only cutting partially through the material and not all the way through. So in order to remove it, if you do need to remove it, you can lift up the lever on the right-hand side, which loosens that mechanism, and lift the splitter straight up. It's also attached to the blade guard and this dust collection arm, so you want to gently just pick it up and move it out of the way. You can put it down on a workbench over here, or you can swing it around and put it down over here. Just want to make sure that you put it back when you're done so that the next person has it ready to go. Then you would just tighten that lever back down and carry on with your setup. So I'm going to put it back. I'm going to replace the throat plate. You want to make sure that it slides onto the two little screws at the back and that it is perfectly flush with the top of your table saw. The blade guard also has what's called anti-kickback pawls. These are little hooks that, as you're pushing the wood through, they sort of grab onto the wood and allow it to slide forward, but not backwards. They would sort of dig into the wood and keep it from sliding backwards. Again, this is something that you may or may not want to have engaged. So if you want to move them out of the way, for example, you're worried about damaging that clean surface, you can just flip them up and hook them on here. It's a good idea to have them, especially if you're working with rougher material or thick material that might, be a little bit more work for that machine. So there's a couple more adjustments we need to make before we're ready to make our first cut on the table saw. The first is the height of the blade. So this blade can move up or down using this wheel here. So you'll loosen the black knob in the middle and spin that to move the blade up or down. We want to set the blade so that it is just above the height of our material and that the bottom of those gullets are above the top of the material. So right now, right about there should be good. When you have your height set, you can tighten down that knob and you're good to go. You can also adjust the angle of the blade left and right. You can do that using this side knob, which can then move the blade from 0 to 45 degrees. It only tilts one way. So you can use the 45-degree cut or a 30-degree cut to do certain kinds of miters or joinery. But for the most part, we're going to want to have it set at 0. It's also a great idea to check that 0 is actually 0 on a table saw. Usually it stops pretty good, but if you want to make triple sure, there is this tilt box on the side. This is just magnetic. It sticks to the side of the table saw. And this tells us the angle of the blade. Okay, so to use the tilt box, you would set it on the cast iron table and turn it on, and then use the 0 button to set that to a 0 reference. And then you can stick this tilt box to the side of your blade and it'll give you the angle of the blade in relation to the table. So we're aiming for an angle of 0.00, not 0.05 or 0.1. Small inconsistencies in angle can compound and lead to bigger errors later on. So we're aiming for perfection here whenever possible. When you're done with the tilt box, make sure you turn it off so it doesn't run out of batteries, and stick it back on the side of the table. And then we're going to put our throat plate back on. And we're almost ready to make a cut. The last thing we're going to do is decide whether we're going to use the rip fence or a cross-cut method. In this case, we're doing a rip cut. So I'm going to use the fence. For any sort of cut, we always want to make sure that we have some method of support. We're never going to be freehanding a piece of wood through the table saw. This is not a safe machine to freehand. So you're either going to be using the crosscut sled, a miter gauge, or a fence in most cases, or certain special types of jigs can be used for different operations. So the fence can be set to a particular width. Suppose I want to make a cut that is 5¼ inches. I'm going to set that. You can finely adjust it just by gently hitting the side of the fence, and then lock it down by pushing down on this red lever. The fence makes sure that your piece stays nice and parallel to that blade as you're completing the cut. We're also going to want to make sure that we have something to support the piece behind the cut. So these tables are conveniently set at the same height as the table saw, but you want to make sure that it can slide rather than sort of falling down into the back of the table saw. So in order to make a rip cut, what we're going to do is stand slightly to the side of the blade. And we're going to gently be pushing that piece through the blade all the way through until the left side has come free from the right side. If you're making a cut that is wider than about 6 inches, you can do this by hand. You can push the wood between the fence and the blade using a hand. If you are making a cut that's smaller than 6 inches, you always need to use some sort of push block. We have a couple different kinds. This one keeps your hand, well out of the way, but I find it a little bit unstable, so I like to use this push block. It's got a little notch that hooks on the end of your piece and allows you to apply pressure downwards and be pushing the piece through the blade at the same time. When you're making a cut on the table saw, your two different hands have two different jobs. Your left hand, its only job is to keep that wood tight against the fence. So we're not moving that hand towards the blade. It's just nicely planted on the bed and pushing gently into the fence. We don't need to be putting a ton of pressure here. We just want to make sure that that edge stays tight the entire way through the cut. So I'm going to plant my left hand here. Your right hand's job is to guide the piece of wood smoothly through the table saw as you're making your cut. If you have a really long piece, you may need to start this cut with your right hand pushing without a push block. As you approach the table saw in one smooth motion, you can reach over and grab your push block and carry on with the cut. For that reason, you want to make sure that this is always accessible, and then you can reach it without having to reach all the way over there. Again, we're standing slightly to the side, steady stance. And as we're making that cut, we're going to make sure that we're pushing all the way through the blade until the back of that piece of wood is no longer in contact with the blade. The biggest mistake I see beginners make is that they don't push the wood all the way through the blade before letting go. If you let go before the wood has left contact with the blade, that means that the only part of the wood that's touching the blade is back here, and that blade is still spinning, so it can catch and kick back. So we want to make sure that we're pushing all the way through the blade before we let go so that we don't have kickback. Once you've completed your cut and the wood is back here, we don't want to be reaching in between the blade and the fence to grab it. First of all, it might get caught on this splitter mechanism. Second of all, we're putting our hands near a spinning blade. Instead, you have a couple of options. You can walk around, remove your piece from the side. You can also reach around the side and bring it over the fence before returning it to you. Or you can have a buddy helping you, receiving the piece on the other end and passing it back to you, making sure not to pass that piece of wood over the blade. So I'm going to go ahead and make a rip cut. Another thing to be cautious of with the SawStop is that the SawStop can trigger if your wood is particularly wet. That's because water conducts current from your fingers. So if you're cutting really wet wood, please don't use the SawStop. There is a way to override the SawStop mechanism, but you should definitely ask a shop steward before cutting anything wet. It's also really important that you don't cut anything metal on the SawStop, and that includes any little bits of staples or nails that might have become embedded in your wood. Again, the metal can conduct electricity and can trigger the SawStop, and it can also just, cutting metal can damage the blades over time, so it's just not something that we want to cut. So to turn on the machine, we're going to first we flip this switch here, and you'll see two lights, a green light and a red flashing light. You need to wait for the red light to stop flashing before you can turn the machine on. That's just the SawStop mechanism powering up. Once it's stopped, then we can pull this red paddle towards you to start the machine. If at any point you are making your cut and you feel like something's wrong, or you're not able to push all the way through and you need to stop the machine, all you need to do is use your knee to kick that red lever. Make sure you don't let go of your piece as you're doing that. Once you kick the lever to turn the machine on, you can wait for that blade to stop, and then you can let go and investigate. We never want to be forcing something that feels wrong or that we're not able to push through the machine. Again, we want the machine to do the work for us. We don't want to be doing the work for the machine. So you'll notice that I left my left hand in place, and once the wood passed it, I just let go and continued the cut with my right hand. You'll also notice that there is a small piece that got left behind, and you may be worried about kickback. Sometimes this piece does sort of slide back towards you, but because it's not being pinched or trapped between the fence and the blade, it's not going to have very much force behind it, and that's not a cause for concern. What is a cause for concern is if this piece were to get trapped or stuck. Because it's being pinched by the fence and the blade, that's when kickback can have enough force to cause harm. Sometimes this little piece also gets stuck in the sliver between the blade and the throat plate. In that case, of course, you never want to reach and grab it while the blade is still running. Turn the machine off, wait for it to stop before you go and fish that piece out. Of course, the blade guard should also always be down as you're making these cuts. I just left it up so that you could see what I was doing. So now that we've done our rip cut, we've completed S4S. We have 4 surface sides that are flat, parallel, and perpendicular to each other. Now that we have an S4S piece of lumber, we can cut to our final length, technically the 5th and 6th sides of our piece. So in order to do that, we're going to be cross-cutting. So we're no longer going to be using the fence. We can move it well out of the way. Because we're changing operations, we're going to double check to make sure that the blade we're using is appropriate. Again, we're using the combination blade, so that should be okay. And for cross-cutting, you have 2 options. You can use the miter gauge, which lives down on the right side of the machine. Miter gauge slides on one of these tracks, makes a perpendicular cut as you're holding your piece against this fence like this. This one is not looking square, so again, it's always a good idea to check. This is looking a little bit off. So miter gauge is an option for making crosscuts, but I prefer to use the crosscut sled. And that also lives underneath. The crosscut sled is a larger assembly that slides on 2 tracks here. And it's a really nice, sturdy support for making crosscuts that gives you really precise results. I also think it's safer for beginners. So when you're using a crosscut sled, obviously our material height is a little bit higher now because it's sitting on this bed, so we're going to have to raise the blade up. We're also going to have to remove the splitter. So I'll set the blade height again. We want to be higher than the material so that those gullets are just exposed. Tighten it. So this edge, although it is nice and straight because I did it on the chop saw, we want to make sure that it's not only straight, but it's also 90 degrees to the rest of the faces. So the first thing we're going to do on the crosscut sled is just cut off a sliver so that we get a nice 90-degree edge. So to do that, I'm going to position it just past the blade so that a small sliver will be removed. I'm going to be holding on whichever side is safer to hold. So if you're cutting in the middle of the piece, you can hold it on either side. But if you're cutting on the end of the piece, you're obviously going to want to hold it on the long side. There are pencil lines on the top and front of the crosscut sled. We want to make sure that our hands are never past these pencil lines. That's because the blade is going to be exiting the crosscut sled right here, and we don't want to have our thumbs or our fingers anywhere near that. So keeping your hands outside of those pencil lines. I like to use my left hand to be pulling the wood back towards the front of the crosscut sled and holding it steady, and using my right hand to push the crosscut sled smoothly over the blade. Again, you can do that on either side. In that case, I would just switch my hands and do it the other way. In this case, it's easier on the left side because there's a wider bed for it to be supported. So go ahead and make that cut. So when you're making your cut on the crosscut sled, you want to make sure that you keep when you start the blade, the wood that you're cutting is not in contact with any of the teeth. Start the blade up and then push it until your piece comes loose, and then gently pull it back and then stop the blade. Or you can leave the blade running and position in line for your next cut. If you're doing multiple cuts and want to achieve greater accuracy, you can use a stop block on the crosscut sled. So I'm going to be making 2 cuts that are 8 inches long. So in order to do that, I'm going to have to set the stop block up on the side of the crosscut sled. So once I've squared that edge, I want to make sure that that's the end that I'm cutting from and using as a reference against the stop block. You can mark it by drawing a little square symbol in the corner. So what I'll do is I'll mark out my 8-inch dimension on my piece. And then I'll use that mark to line up with one of the teeth on the blade. You want to make sure that the blade is on the opposite side of the piece that you want to remove. So all blades have a kerf to them, which is the thickness of the blade. This one is about 1/8 of an inch. So the blade is going to be removing 1/8 of an inch on this side of the material. If we positioned our cut over here, we would end up with a measurement of 7 7/8 inch, not 8 inches. So we want to make sure that we're positioning the wood on the right side of our pencil line, on the correct side of our pencil line, not necessarily the right. Once we've done that, I'm going to pull this back and set up a stop block. What this allows is for me to make that first cut and then slide the piece down towards the stop block again and make my second cut, and I'll have 2 pieces that are exactly the same. If I were to do both pieces using just a pencil mark, they might be a little bit off, and again, it's those small inconsistencies that can compound, leading to bigger problems later on. If you are trying to do a crosscut with a stop block that is longer than the width of the crosscut sled, you may need to use the fence for your stop block, with one caveat. We would never use the fence on its own to create that stop. So say I wanted a piece that is 14 inches. I might be tempted to set that fence up at 14 inches, slide that piece down, and use that as my stop. The risk with doing that is, again, with kickback and pinching the blade, because now we have a piece of wood that isn't fully supported by the crosscut sled. It is sliding along this fence, and if there were any nicks or things that caught on there, it could cause that wood to shift a little bit as you're making your cut, and it could bind against the blade and cause a kickback or cause some other sort of injury. So instead, you can use the stop block with the fence like this, so that you have your reference near the back of your cut where the wood isn't contacting the blade. And then as you slide your piece up, there's a gap between the fence and the wood so that that wood is free to move and not get bound or pinched by the blade. Making sure that I pull this sled back before I make my cut. Turn the machine on. And if you're using a stop block, you want to make sure that you're supporting that piece on the side that the stop block is on. So if my stop block is on the left, I'm supporting the piece on the left. If the stop block was on the right, for example, if it was attached to the fence, I would be supporting the piece on the right. Again, that's just to keep that wood from being able to shift and get trapped between the stop block or the fence and the blade. So I'll make my second cut. And you'll see that these two pieces are exactly the same length and ready for joinery.